The coffee mug sat there, still warm to the touch, steam curling up from the untouched liquid like a ghost of the morning that never finished. Sarah's fingers traced the rim, the same blue ceramic mug he'd used every morning for 3 years. The one with the tiny chip on the handle from when little Emma had knocked it against the sink last Christmas. But this morning was different. This morning, the mug would grow cold. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, and for a split second, she could almost hear his voice echoing from the kitchen. "Save me some coffee for when I get back." The words hung in the air like a promise that felt both certain and impossibly fragile. Through the window, the harbor stretched out like a steel-gray canvas, and somewhere in that maze of ships and cranes, he was walking away from everything they'd built together. The uniform he'd pressed the night before, hands steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. The duffel bag packed with letters she'd slipped inside when he wasn't looking. The phone buzzed against the counter a text message that would change everything she thought she knew about goodbyes. "The ship leaves in 30 minutes. I can see the pier from here. I wish... ... The message cut off. Incomplete. Just like the coffee growing cold in her hands. What she didn't know yet was that 27 miles away, on the deck of a naval destroyer, her husband was gripping the metal railing so tight his knuckles had gone white, staring at that same horizon, carrying a secret that would make this departure unlike any other they'd ever faced. The wind was picking up. The ship's horn was about to sound. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thompson had been Sarah's husband for 8 years, but he'd been the Navy's man for 15. She used to joke that she married him in his dress whites, but the ocean had claimed him long before she ever said, "I do." This deployment was supposed to be different, supposed to be his last. The house on Maple Street still carried traces of their hurried morning, Emma's backpack by the door, cartoon characters smiling obliviously from the fabric, 7-year-old Tommy's superhero action figures scattered across the living room carpet, frozen mid-battle in poses that seemed almost prophetic now. The children were at school, blissfully unaware that their father's ship was preparing to slice through waters that might keep him for 9 months. Or longer. Sarah picked up Marcus's reading glasses from the nightstand, the ones he'd forgotten, in his rush to beat traffic to the base. Such a small thing, but it felt monumental now. How do you see clearly when you're an ocean away from the people who matter most? She'd planned to drive them to him, maybe steal one more kiss at the pier, but the morning had unraveled too quickly. The framed photograph on the mantel told their story in frozen moments. Marcus in uniform, Sarah in her white sundress, the kids building sandcastles during their last vacation in Virginia Beach. Emma had insisted on burying Daddy's feet in the sand that day, giggling as she declared him trapped forever. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah now. In the kitchen drawer, beneath old takeout menus and loose batteries, lay the letter she'd written but never sent. 3 pages of everything she was too afraid to say out loud. How the quiet terrified her more than his absence. How she'd practiced conversations with his empty chair. How she'd started sleeping on his side of the bed just to remember what his pillow smelled like. Marcus didn't know about the letter, just like he didn't know she'd been calling his mother every night, crying into the phone about things that hadn't even happened yet. But there were things Sarah didn't know either. She didn't know that Marcus had been awake since 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and memorizing the sound of her breathing. She didn't know he'd slipped into the kids' rooms before dawn, kissing their foreheads and whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. She didn't know about the sealed envelope in his breast pocket he marked, to be opened only if ... Time moves differently when you're counting down to goodbye. Sarah had learned this lesson through 5 previous deployments, but somehow the knowledge never made it easier. The weeks before departure stretched like taffy, sticky, endless, and impossible to break cleanly. Every mundane moment became precious and painful simultaneously. Brushing teeth together at the bathroom sink, fighting over the remote control, the weight of his arm across her shoulders during late-night movies, they'd both seen a dozen times. 3 weeks ago, when the deployment orders came through, they'd made lists, practical things, automatic bill payments, emergency contacts for the school, who to call if the washing machine broke again. But the real preparation happened in the spaces between words, in glances that lingered too long, in the way Marcus's hand would find hers during dinner without either of them acknowledging it. Sarah started taking pictures of everything. Marcus reading bedtime stories, his voice dropping to whispers during the scary parts. Marcus fixing Tommy's bicycle chain, grease smudged across his forehead, that concentrated frown she'd fallen in love with. Marcus dancing in the kitchen while scrambling eggs, completely off rhythm and utterly Her phone became a desperate archive of ordinary moments that would have to sustain her for months. The children felt it too, though they couldn't name it. Emma started crawling into their bed every night, her small body a bridge between her parents. Tommy began following Marcus around the house like a shadow, mimicking his father's walk, his gestures, even the way he cleared his throat. They were memorizing him without knowing they were doing it. The hardest part was the pretending. Pretending this deployment was routine. Pretending 9 months wasn't an eternity. Pretending that Marcus's increasing quietness was just pre-deployment focus, not something deeper and more troubling. He'd started taking longer showers, standing under the hot water as if he could wash away whatever was eating at him from the inside. Last Tuesday, Sarah found him in the garage at 2 a.m., organizing tools that were already organized. His movements were mechanical, methodical, like a man trying to solve an unsolvable problem with socket wrenches and screwdrivers. "Can't sleep?" she'd asked from the doorway. "Just making sure everything's in order for you," he'd replied without turning around. But his voice carried weight that had nothing to do with household maintenance. The sealed envelope appeared that same week. Sarah glimpsed it when Marcus was changing clothes, a flash of white paper sticking out from his uniform jacket. When she asked about it, he'd deflected with a joke about Navy paperwork. But jokes don't require sealed envelopes marked with someone else's handwriting. The lies they told each other became a third presence in their marriage. Sarah pretended she didn't notice Marcus writing letters he never sent. Marcus pretended he didn't see Sarah researching Navy casualty notifications on her laptop after midnight. They moved around each other like dancers who'd forgotten the steps, careful not to step on truths that might shatter everything. Emma drew pictures of their family, but Daddy was always on a boat floating far from the stick-figure house where Mommy and the children waved from windows. When Marcus saw the drawings, something flickered behind his eyes, pride mixed with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Why does Daddy look sad in the boat?" Tommy asked one evening, pointing at Emma's latest artwork. "He's not sad," Sarah answered quickly. "He's just far away." But distance wasn't the problem. The problem was in that sealed envelope, in Marcus's 2 a.m. tool organizing, in the way he'd started saying, "I love you," like he was running out of time to say it. The problem was that this goodbye felt different from all the others, weighted with secrets that made the waiting unbearable and the leaving unthinkable. The coffee maker gurgled to life each morning, marking another day closer to departure. 24 days, 18 days, 7 days, 3 days, 3 days. The countdown echoed in everything. Grocery shopping, this will have to last while he's gone. Laundry folding, make sure he has enough socks. Bedtime stories, remembered Daddy's voice reading this. Tomorrow was departure day. Tonight was their last night, as a complete family for 9 months, or maybe longer. Marcus Thompson had been trained to compartmentalize. 15 years in the Navy teaches you to lock away fear, doubt, and longing in separate mental boxers, sealed tight and stored in the deepest corners of your mind. But this morning, standing on the pier with his duffel bag at his feet, Every box was rattling open. The USS Constellation stretched before him like a steel mountain, her hull painted the color of storm clouds. Home for the next 9 months. He'd served on destroyers before, knew every inch of cramped quarters, the smell of diesel fuel mixed with salt air, the way the engines hummed through the bulkheads at night. But familiarity brought no comfort today. His breast pocket felt heavier than it should. The envelope thin paper that somehow weighed more than his entire gear bag. Inside, handwritten in his commanding officer's careful script, were orders that changed everything. Orders that Sarah couldn't know about. Orders that made this deployment unlike any other he'd ever faced. Operation Deep Current. The briefing had been labeled classified. Need to know basis. What Marcus knew was enough to make him understand why the sealed envelope was marked emergency contact only. They weren't just going on patrol. They were going somewhere that ships sometimes didn't come back from. The worst part wasn't the danger Marcus had made peace with that years ago. The worst part was the silence. Sitting at the kitchen table last night, watching Emma color inside the lines of her princess coloring book, knowing he might never see her graduate from kindergarten, watching Tommy build Lego towers, knowing those little hands might have to grow up without his guidance. And Sarah, God, Sarah. She'd fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder during the late movie, her breathing soft and trusting. Marcus had stayed awake all night, memorizing the weight of her against him. The way her hair smelled like the lavender shampoo she'd used since college. He'd counted her heartbeats, tried to sync his breathing with hers, tried to steal just a few more hours of being her husband before he became the Navy's property again. The hardest letter to write had been the one for Emma and Tommy. How do you explain to children why Daddy might not come home? How do you pack 15 years of fatherhood into paragraphs that a 7-year-old might understand someday? Marcus had written 17 drafts, each one soaked with tears. He hadn't allowed himself to cry since boot camp. Thompson, Chief Petty Officer. Rodriguez's voice cut through his thoughts. You planning on boarding today? Or should we leave without you? Marcus shouldered his bag, the familiar weight settling against his spine. Around him, other sailors were saying their own goodbyes. Some quick and businesslike, handshakes and nods. Others prolonged and desperate, wives clinging to uniforms, children refusing to let go of their father's hands. But none of them carried the weight Marcus carried. None of them knew what Operation Deep Current really meant. As he walked up the gangway, Marcus's phone buzzed one last time. A text from Sarah. I love you more than the ocean is wide. Come home to us. The irony was crushing. The ocean's width was exactly what stood between him and keeping that promise. At the ship's rail, Marcus pulled out his phone to text back, but the words wouldn't come. How do you respond to a promise you might not be able to keep? How do you lie to the person who knows your heart better than you do? Instead, he typed, I love you, all of you. Remembered that, no matter what. He hit send before he could change his mind, before he could soften the finality of those words. The ship's horn blasted across the harbor, one long, mournful note that seemed to echo from the steel hull straight into his chest. Sailors moved, with practiced efficiency around him, but Marcus stood frozen at the rail, watching the pier grow smaller with each passing second. Somewhere in that maze of cars and warehouses, Sarah was probably pouring out cold coffee, getting ready to pick up the children from school, pretending that today was just another Tuesday. She didn't know that her husband was sailing toward coordinates that appeared on no civilian maps, toward waters where communications could go dark for weeks at a time. The sealed envelope crinkled against his chest with each breath. Inside were not just orders, but contingency plans, phone numbers to call, words to say, arrangements for a future that might arrive sooner than anyone expected. The pier had its own language of goodbye, and Sarah had learned to speak it fluently over the years. The measured steps of families walking toward ships that would steal their fathers and husbands. The forced brightness in voices trying to make final conversations sound casual. The way children's laughter grew higher and more desperate as departure time approached, as if joy itself could anchor their daddies to shore. But today felt different from the moment Sarah turned the corner toward Naval Station Norfolk. The parking lot stretched endlessly, filled with cars that would drive home half empty. Families clustered near the pier entrance, some still arriving, others already locked in embraces that seemed to defy time itself. Sarah parked between a minivan with soccer ball stickers and a pickup truck flying a small American flag, both vehicles bearing the invisible weight of military goodbyes. Emma's hand found hers immediately. "Is that Daddy's ship? Mommy?" The USS Constellation dominated the harbor like a sleeping giant. Sarah had seen destroyers before, but this one seemed larger, more ominous. Its gray hull reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror of stormy seas. "Yes, sweetheart. That's Daddy's ship." Tommy pressed his face against the chain-link fence, his superhero backpack sliding down one shoulder. "It's huge. How many bad guys can it fight?" "Daddy doesn't fight bad guys," Emma corrected with 7-year-old authority. "He just sails around and looks at stuff." If only it were that simple. Sarah's phone buzzed Marcus's text about loving them no matter what. The words hit her like cold water. Military spouses develop a sixth sense about language, about the weight carried in seemingly innocent phrases. No matter what wasn't something you said before a routine deployment. The crowd began moving toward the pier entrance, a slow river of families flowing toward the inevitable. Sarah's steps felt mechanical, each one bringing them closer to a goodbye that her instincts screamed was wrong somehow. Around them, other wives wore the same forced composure, the same bright smiles that never quite reached their eyes. "There's Daddy." Tommy's voice cut through the ambient noise of engines and conversations. Marcus stood near the ship's gangway, his duffel bag at his feet, scanning the crowd. When their eyes met across 50 yards of concrete and chaos, Sarah saw something that made her stomach drop. Fear, undisguised fear in the eyes of a man who'd faced down storms in the North Atlantic and never blinked. He started walking toward them, his uniform crisp, despite the morning's humidity, but his gait was different, heavier, like he was carrying invisible weight that threatened to drag him down with every step. Other sailors moved around him with practiced efficiency, but Marcus moved like a man walking toward his own execution. "Daddy." Emma broke free from Sarah's hand and ran, her pink sneakers slapping against the concrete. Marcus caught her mid-leap, lifting her up and spinning her in a circle that should have been joyful but somehow felt desperate. When he set her down, he crouched to her level, his hands framing her small face. "I need you to be brave for Mommy while I'm gone, okay?" His voice was steady, but Sarah caught the tremor underneath. "And remember what we practiced?" Iman nodded solemnly. "If I miss you, I look at the moon, because you'll be looking at it too. That's my girl." Tommy approached more cautiously, suddenly shy in the face of actual goodbye. Marcus ruffled his hair, then pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than usual. Over Tommy's shoulder, Marcus's eyes found Sarah's again, and in that look was an entire conversation they couldn't have. "I'm scared." "So am I. Something's wrong with this deployment. I know. I love you. Come home to us." The ship's horn blasted once, a warning that departure was imminent. Around them, other families were beginning their final embraces, the pier transforming into a tableau of controlled heartbreak. Children who didn't understand why everyone was crying. Wives who understood too much. Marcus stood slowly, Tommy still clinging to his leg. When he finally stepped toward Sarah, the space between them felt electric with unspoken words. His hands found her face, thumbs tracing the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I wrote you a letter," he said quietly, his forehead pressed against hers. "It's in my sock drawer, under the running socks you never wear. Marcus, why are you just... If anything happens, rat it fierce before you read anything else. Promise me." The ship's horn sounded again, longer this time, more insistent. Around them, sailors were beginning to board, their families releasing them one by one like balloons into an uncertain sky. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. But even as she said it, she did understand. She understood that her husband's fear was infectious, spreading through her chest like ice water. She understood that this goodbye carried weight that could sink ships. Marcus pulled the children close, creating a circle of 4 bodies against the inevitable. His voice when he spoke was meant for all of them, but seemed to come from some place deeper than his throat. "No matter what happens, remember that every sunrise I see, I'll be thinking of you. Every sunset, every star, every wave. You are the reason I'll find my way home." The words hung in the salt air like a promise and a prayer and a goodbye all rolled into one. The moment of letting go exists outside of time. Marcus's arms tightened around his family one last time, as if he could somehow press them into his bones, carry them with him into whatever darkness waited beyond the horizon. Sarah felt his heartbeat against her cheek, rapid, desperate, nothing like the steady rhythm she'd fallen asleep to for 8 years. "I have to go," he whispered, but his arms contradicted his words, holding tighter instead of releasing. Emma looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for 7 years old. "Daddy, why does your face look like when Tommy breaks something important?" The question shattered something in Marcus's chest. He knelt again, bringing himself to her eye level, his large hands cradling her small face like she was made of spun glass. "Sometimes grown-ups get scared too, sweetheart. But being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave. Are you scared of the ocean?" Marcus's throat worked silently for a moment. Around them, other families were breaking apart. Fathers walking up gangways while mothers and children watched from behind safety lines that might as well have been prison bars. "No, Emma. I'm scared of forgetting the sound of your laugh." Tommy pressed closer, his superhero backpack sliding forgotten to the concrete. "Then don't forget, Daddy. Just remember really, really hard." "I will. I promise I will." Sarah watched her husband memorize their children's faces, and she memorized him doing it, the way his thumb traced Emma's cheek, the way he straightened Tommy's shirt collar one last time, the way his jaw clenched as he fought to keep his composure. Sarah. Her name on his lips carried 8 years of marriage, 5 deployments, 2 births, countless midnight feedings, Christmas mornings, fights about money, making up in the dark, dreams built and rebuilt and built again. Their final kiss tasted like salt and goodbye and promises that might not survive the ocean's depth. Marcus's hands tangled in her hair, and for a moment Sarah forgot about the ship, the pier, the watching crowd. For a moment there was only this, the man she loved holding her, like she was his anchor in a world gone adrift. "Read the letter," he whispered against her lips. "No matter what anyone tells you, read it first. Marcus, you're scaring me. I'm sorry. God. Sarah, I'm so sorry." The apology held weight that went beyond this departure, beyond the months of separation ahead. It was an apology for secrets he couldn't share, for fears he couldn't voice, for leaving when every instinct screamed at him to stay. The ship's final horn blast shattered their embrace, like glass hitting stone. "All aboard?" Final call. Marcus straightened slowly, his uniform jacket suddenly seeming too heavy for his shoulders. He picked up his duffel bag with movements that looked automated, mechanical, like muscle memory overriding a heart that wanted to rebel. "I love you," he said, to all 3 of them, his voice carrying across the growing space between them. "I love you more than the ocean is deep, more than the sky is wide. Remember that when ... He stopped himself, swallowed the words that wanted to escape. Remember that always. Sarah wanted to run after him, wanted to grab his arm and demand answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Instead, she gathered Emma and Tommy against her sides, creating a wall of family solidarity against the inevitable. Marcus walked up the gangway, like a man climbing gallows steps. At the top, he turned one last time, and Sarah saw him clearly silhouetted against the gray sky. Her husband, the father of her children, a man carrying secrets that made his shoulders bow under invisible weight. He raised his hand in farewell. The gesture seemed to hang suspended in the salt air, a freeze-frame moment that Sarah knew would replay in her dreams for months to come. Around them, other families were waving, calling out final words of love and encouragement. But Marcus's wave felt different. Final. Like a man saying goodbye to more than his family, like a man saying goodbye to the future he'd planned to live. The gangway rose with mechanical precision, sealing the space between ship and shore. Sarah felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, felt Tommy press against her leg, and realized that the three of them were now an incomplete equation, missing the variable that made them whole. "Look, Mommy." Emma pointed toward the ship's rail. "There's Daddy." Marcus stood at the railing, still visible, but already impossibly far away. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the white envelope in his hand, the one he'd carried in his breast pocket, the one that held secrets she couldn't begin to imagine. As the USS Constellation's engines rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the water and up through the concrete pier, Marcus held up the envelope so she could see it. Then, in a gesture that made Sarah's heart stop, he pressed it against his chest, over his heart. A message? A promise? A warning? This matters. This is important. This changes everything. The ship began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Water churned white at her stern, and the distance between ship and shore grew from feet to yards, to something that felt insurmountable. Marcus never left the railing, never stopped watching his family grow smaller on the pier. His final wave came when the ship was so far from shore that Sarah could barely distinguish his uniform from the gray expanse of the destroyer's hull. But she waved back anyway, lifting Emma so she could see, steadying Tommy as he jumped, and called out words that the winds stole before they could reach their father's ears. When the USS Constellation finally disappeared beyond the horizon, becoming nothing more than a dark smudge against the gray morning sky, Sarah realized she was holding her breath, had been holding it since that final horn blast, as if releasing it would make this goodbye complete. The pier began to empty around them, families drifting back to cars that would carry them home to houses that would echo with absence. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't turn away from the empty horizon where her husband had vanished. In her pocket her phone buzzed with one final message. "I love you. No matter what comes next, I love you." The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that felt foreign now, as if the world had shifted while they stood on that pier watching a piece of their family disappear into gray water. Emma fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted by emotions too large for her small body to contain. Tommy stared out the window, unusually quiet, his superhero backpack clutched against his chest like armor against a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white against the black leather. The radio played soft jazz, the kind of music Marcus liked during long Sunday drives. But today it felt like background music to a funeral she wasn't ready to attend. At home, the coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, the liquid inside now room temperature and bitter. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, before finally pouring it down the sink, watching the brown stream spiral down the drain like the last remnant of their normal morning routine. The house felt different already. Not empty emptiness would come later, when the children stopped asking when Daddy would call, when his scent faded from the pillows, when the silence stretched beyond what memory could fill. No, this was something else. This was the weight of secrets pressing against the walls, the knowledge that somewhere in Marcus's sock drawer waited answers to questions she hadn't known she needed to ask. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, Sarah made peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, helped Emma change out of her church dress, and listened to Tommy explain in elaborate detail how his superhero action figures would protect the house while Daddy was gone. Normal things. Grounding things. Activities that proved life could continue even when part of your heart was sailing toward coordinates marked on classified maps. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and stared at Marcus's dresser. The top drawer held his running socks, the expensive moisture-wicking ones she'd bought him for his birthday but never borrowed because they were too big, too technical, too essentially his. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus made it aboard safely. Think of you. Always. Kiss the kids for me. Just like every other deployment. Normal communication for abnormal circumstances. She typed back, "We love you. Come home safe." But her fingers hesitated over the send button. "Call me home safe." Such simple words that carried the weight of every military wife's prayer, every child's wish, every family's desperate hope that service and love could somehow coexist without one destroying the other. She sent the message and immediately felt the inadequacy of it. How do you compress 8 years of marriage, 2 children, and a lifetime of dreams into a text message that travels across oceans to reach a man carrying secrets that make him walk like he's bearing the weight of the world? The truth was, you couldn't. The truth was, military families learn to live in the spaces between words, in glances that carried entire conversations, in embraces that had to sustain months of absence. They learned that love could stretch across time zones and survive in the silence between phone calls. They learned that I love thee wasn't just an expression of feeling, it was a promise, a prayer, and sometimes a goodbye, all contained in 3 simple words. Sarah looked again at the dresser drawer. Tomorrow? Maybe. Tonight, she needed to believe that her husband was simply deployed, not disappeared into circumstances that required letters hidden in sock drawers and final waves that felt like last chances, but somewhere in the back of her mind, where fears lived in the shadow of hope, Sarah understood that this deployment would test more than their ability to endure separation. It would test whether love could survive not just distance, but the weight of secrets that some marriages were never meant to carry. The USS Constellation was somewhere beyond the horizon now, carrying her husband toward whatever truth lived in that classified envelope. And here, in a house that still smelled like his coffee and echoed with his laughter, Sarah would wait. She would maintain the routines that held their family together, answer the children's questions with brave smiles, and count the days until a ship appeared on the horizon carrying the man she loved home to the life they'd built together. But tonight, as she fell asleep on his side of the bed, breathing in the fading scent of his pillow, Sarah allowed herself one honest moment, the admission that some goodbyes change you, that some farewells carve themselves so deeply into your heart that even when the person returns, you're never quite the same. The coffee mug would sit empty tomorrow morning. The children would ask when Daddy was calling. The house would begin its slow transformation from home to place. And in a sock drawer, a letter would continue to hold answers that might change everything. If this story of love, sacrifice, and the unspoken courage of military families has touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who understands that some promises are kept not with words, but with the quiet determination to love across any distance. Because every family deserves to know their story matters, their weight has meaning, and their love is stronger than any ocean that tries to divide them.